Well, a very good morning to you. Thank you so much for sticking with us. We continue with this morning conversation right here on Good Morning Kenya. My name is Aguko. It's a pleasure being with you today. It is the 30th of August 2023, and right on Good Morning Kenya still, we want to proceed with the next conversation this morning. Climate change is a conversation that we need to have. Many organizations and NGOs are at the forefront when it comes to conversations on climate change and mitigating its effects. Well, this morning, we will follow suit because as we speak, the country is planning to have the climate summit coming in next week. And this conversation is coming at a right time because this morning, we want to talk about climate change and human mobility in the country. How does climate change affect human mobility? I know for some these are terms that may be complicated, but we shall break it down. To help us in this conversation, I am joined by Dimanche Sharon. She is the Chief of Mission at IOM Kenya. Welcome to the program.
Thank you very much, Ram, for having me.
Thank you for coming. How are you feeling this morning?
I'm very great and very excited to be here.
All right. And from those who are watching us from home, engage with us as we proceed with this conversation. As I said, my name is Aguko. Thank you so much for sticking with us. The hashtag, as always, is Good Morning Kenya. At KBC Channel 1 is our Twitter handle, and at Aguko, which is my handle. This is The Viewpoint, climate change and human mobility. But first, Mrs. Dimanche, I would like to understand some few aspects. Let's break it down to Kenyans watching us today. We are talking about IOM first. What's IOM all about?
Thank you very much again, Ram, for having me here. My name is Dimanche Sharon. I am the Chief of Mission of IOM, the International Organization for Migration. It's a UN migration agency. We mainly handle everything to do with migration. We work closely with the government, supporting them to ensure a more dignified, humane mobility of human beings, to ensure that we actually benefit from migration. Migrants will benefit, the governments will benefit, and those who are the host community will actually benefit. And that's our work as IOM.
So those leaving the country and those getting into the country.
Exactly,
also.
exactly.
Right. Now, why is climate change important? Because now we're talking about climate change and human mobility. Why is it important for us to have a conversation on climate change in the world of today?
Thank you, that's a very good question. For us in IOM, the nexus of climate change and human mobility is one of IOM's top priorities. And it is a priority because if you look back at human history, migration is part of us. We can't do away from it. It's normal. If I would ask you, Ram, where you come from, I don't think you'd be coming from Nairobi. Maybe you come from somewhere else, I don't know.
My home country is Kisumu County.
Kisumu County, exactly. Yes. So you're born in Kisumu, came to Nairobi, maybe you've lived somewhere else, and that's migration, that's part of us. We can't stop. Migration is like water, just flows. You can never stop it. But if you don't actually plan for it, it becomes quite destructive. And that's, I mean, looking at migration, it's very normal. But now we're talking about migration and climate change. Environmental degradation. Climate change is not normal. When you get displaced because of climate change, that's not normal. We have seen people leaving their home areas because of floods, because of droughts. They get displaced, they leave everything behind, their livelihood is destroyed, and that is where I think it's not normal, and we have to do something. I'll give you a very brief story of a young girl called Jackie. Jackie is 11 years old. She lived with her grandmother, with a brother who is about 15 years old, and this is a true story. Jackie had dreams like every other child. She dreamed to be a doctor. But because of the challenges, because of drought, they lived in a place where food was very scarce. She would walk miles and miles looking for water, for food, and that meant she wouldn't go to school. Sometimes Jackie with her mother and the brother, grandmother, they would go farming for food. And of course, because they depended on farming, at some point, the yields would be very poor because of drought. So they had to leave their home, went to another place. In that place, it was actually very challenging. And then suddenly, rains came. and the floods. Then Jackie and her mother and her grandmother had to be rescued. The only hope they had was a rescue boat. In that whole process, the grandmother felt the only way Jackie could be secure and safe was to sell her off to an old man who could actually provide food for her. Well, one would say grandmother was careless, but I think she was very challenged and she had nothing to do. She thought that was the best decision for Jackie in her best interest. Jackie became pregnant as a child. She missed her school and went in a camp where it was overcrowded. She lost her home, the livelihood, and her dreams were shattered.
Wow.
And we have so many of such Jackies because of climate change, because of drought, because of floods. As we speak now, in 2021, over 2.7 million people got displaced by climate change in Africa and and the Middle East. We are in the Horn of Africa in Kenya.
Yes.
We have been grappling with drought, which is, I think, the most severe in the last 40 years.
Yes.
Several people have been affected. We see about estimated 36 million people across Ethiopia, Somalia, Kenya, and Djibouti have been affected in one way or the other. And 2.3 million people have already been displaced by this drought. And we have so many of these Jackies who have lost all their dreams, have lost their livelihood, have lost all their plans because of climate change. And the main pathways of climate-induced migration is through, when you look at losing livelihood, economic conditions actually destroyed. And this is more prevalent and relevant in Africa, where we depend on natural resources, where the largest proportions of the population is highly dependent on farming, on fisheries. And when we have climate change, of course, with drought affecting and destroying everything.
And you know, Kenyans watching today, I know sometimes you may be wondering, why is this conversation important? Look at, remember, that time, there was a time in the country where we had the longest drought. You've mentioned it.
Yeah.
Remember that drought? And we were talking about, you know, we were praying for rains to come. We were praying for God to bring in rains. Now this is an intervention that we are coming up with. Conversations that can help us to know what solutions can we provide so that we don't face what we don't go through what we went through. We don't have to face again what we faced before. People were affected. Look at Turkana counties. People, you know, many counties in Kenya. Now, do you believe that it is possible for us to be able to, look back and say, you know what, there are things that we can do. There are interventions that can be put in place. Are they there? Yes,
I would say they are there. It's about actually taking action. Maybe coming back to Kenya, you talked about, of course, the displacement in Kenya that we have seen, the drought.
Yes.
We see, because of this long drought, the flash floods in Kenya, the landslides, desertification, we were actually grappling recently with the desert locusts. That means we're all food insecure, and that's again because of climate change.
Yes.
And then when you look at water scarcity, again, that affects farmers. Because of climate change. As you look at maybe going back to your home village in Kisumu, maybe you do a lot of fishing.
Yes,
again, if the water levels go down, it means you're going to lose out.
Yes.
But in other areas, maybe in the northern part of the country, some people depend on agriculture. It becomes actually very challenging. We did an assessment. We have what we call the displacement tracking matrix, and we did an assessment in 2022 alone. We have seen about 465,000 Kenyans have been displaced in Garissa, in Isiolo, in Marsabit, Samburu, and Turkana counties, simply because of drought. For us, on our side as IOM, we have done quite a lot, working closely with the government, of course. We don't do that alone.
Yes.
And in partnership with other agencies, the UN agencies and our development partners. And our response is covered in three parts. We have the immediate response, which is humanitarian. You provide immediate food, you provide shelter, hygiene kits.
So these are the things we are doing right now to help the situation.
To help the situation. But besides the immediate sort of support, you also need to look at the long-term assistance, where you have actually to prepare and make sure that you have more adaptation strategies in place, that people are more resilient. They carry out...
Now, allow me to interject you on that. Because we're heading to the long term, let's address the short term things that we can do at the moment.
Yes.
We can break it down into two: short term and long term. Starting the short term, what can we do, and then you get to the long term.
The short term immediately provide life-saving interventions.
Okay.
We are dealing with human beings here.
Yes.
We have to make sure they're actually safe. Their lives are sustainable. They are sustained during that whole time. And as I said, we provided food to those who are affected, hygiene. I mentioned about the story of Jackie, where you are in an IDP camp, overcrowded. You don't have enough water, again, because of drought, scarcity. So it means you have issues to do with your hygiene. And if we provide that support, it will really help you.
Did you manage the IDP camps?
We went out to the camps and gave some of those hygiene kits, and were able to provide that assistance to those who were affected. And then another support that we gave was providing drought-resilient trees and vegetable seedlings to over 44,000 families that were affected by drought in the northern part of the country. And we have given trainings to those actually also who affected. Over 14,000 families and households have been provided with training to ensure that they have look at more climate-smart agriculture to improve their livelihood that have actually been affected by drought. They lost everything, their livestock, their livelihood, including their property. So they have to rebuild to be able to sustain themselves for that very short term.
Now we can get those are short term.
And the cash intervention that we have given to people, because sometimes I can give you food, but you also need money to actually take care of other needs, and we have done that.
We can go to the long term now. Those projects that we can engage in that can tell us, you know what, there is a future, because someone may ask, is it too late to prevent climate change? That's a very important question. But address the long-term issues.
Yeah, I would say it's not too late, but it's very urgent. We need to take urgent actions. And when we are talking about climate change, let's not forget human mobility, because we have human beings at the center of all this. If there is drought, if there is flood, people will definitely move. They will leave their home areas. They will leave the places they were used to, they called home, their legacy, their heritage, everything about them. So just imagine Ram leaving Nairobi now. You're based in Nairobi, going to a far place, maybe in the northern part of the country. You have never been there, and you're starting a new life.
Difficult.
And you just walk out only with yourself.
It's very difficult.
It's very, very challenging.
Yes.
You really have to recalibrate and think through, how do I start a new life? So when we are having these conversations on climate change, yes, there are those big agenda, which is very important. Again, on climate financing, we need the resources. And I really commend the government of Kenya for this leadership to make sure that Africans actually come together to address some of these challenges. And I would like also to highlight and again thank the government for bringing in human mobility into the discussion on climate change. Talking about the long-term plan, we are working closely with the government to ensure that we expand the Kampala Declaration on Migration, Environment and Climate Change. That is the first framework of its kind, which started in July 2022 last year. Again, talking about the displacement, there was no framework that brought together the member states to actually talk about the nexus between migration and climate change.
Climate change, yes.
When they realized that, 15 countries met in Uganda and discussed. They thought, okay, we have to sit back and really rethink. On rethinking, I'm happy to announce that they came up with a declaration that they signed for the first time in the history of this world in terms of climate change. And as time moved on, we saw a lot of interest from other countries to expand this declaration to make it more continental, because again, climate change is not only affecting Kenya and not the Eastern Horn of Africa, but the entire Africa.
Wow.
So it was very important to bring together all the African countries to actually sit and have that sort of conversation and have practical ways to address this climate change.
Thank you
and
so
I'm happy
much.
to mention that in Kenya last week, Kenya and Uganda hosted a conference of technical experts, the African Group of Negotiators, to expand this declaration. And my call now is to our ministers next week, in September, 4th of September, to actually sit down and sign that declaration.
I want us to take a short break, and then we'll be back.
Sure.
You've mentioned conferences, and I'm reminded of COP27.
Yes.
The interventions that were there. Looking back from COP27, now next week we're having the climate summit.
Yes.
What are some of those things that have borne fruit so far that we are now looking into? Things that have now made us to say, you know what? We have made these steps, and we can even make more steps. You'll answer that after.
I'll be happy to answer that.
All right?
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Let's take a break, and then we'll be back. It's all about climate change. Did you know that it affects you from wherever you are? We'll be back in a bit. Yes, and we're back. This is still a conversation on climate change, something that affects each and every one of us. How does climate change affect human mobility? I'm with Dimanche, Sharon, the Chief of Mission at IOM Kenya. And before we took that break, you're mentioning some of the events that have taken place that are very important and very key in the conversation that we're having today, including the Kampala Declaration. And I was trying to bring it into the aspect of the COP27 and how the interventions that were there. Before we move on to other issues, just mention something a bit about that. How far are we in implementing decisions and interventions that were there before in previous conferences, and how important is it even in the summit that is coming up next week?
Yeah, thank you, Ram, for that question and really highlighting the importance of the previous conferences. As I would say, even actually before COP27, if you look back, I don't think there's been any conversation on the nexus between climate change and human mobility. For the very first time, the initial discussion that took place on climate change and human mobility was in COP27. And that actually started way back in July. I've referred to the Kampala Declaration, where they thought, oh, by the way, we are talking about climate change, but we have human beings who are getting displaced. What are we actually doing about that? And of course, with IOM as a UN migration agency, handling migration, working with our member states was very, very important to start thinking through how can we help. We had those initial consultation and discussion with key governments, and then held the first meeting or conference in Uganda with the technical meetings, 3 days actually. Kenya was supposed to have led that, but it was actually coming towards election and that didn't take place. So it was moved to Uganda. Again, I'm saying Kenya having the leadership in all these conversations.
Kenya is at the forefront.
Exactly.
And
I really admire Kenya and commend them.
We need to highlight this important thing. It's at the heart of the president.
Yes.
He's been very vocal.
Exactly. And I commend the leadership. So from that, the discussion took place in July 2022 in Kampala. Luckily, in their wisdom, under the leadership of Egypt, because Egypt also attended the meeting in Kampala, plus the chair of the African Group of Negotiators, and decided to really come up with some key recommendations which were extracted from the declaration, take them to COP27. While it did not appear in the main agenda, but it was one of the key discussions, including in the bilaterals, to really come up with a clear position on human mobility and climate change. So fast forward from the COP 27, then recently in the discussion, the meeting that took place for negotiators in Bonn, they are coming up with a climate and mobility nexus. So the discussions in Kampala didn't all go to waste. I was very happy to see that the members are actually taking it across forward. And then COP 27, at least they featured for the first time a conversation on climate change and human mobility. And I'm really looking forward that even in COP 28, they will have this discussion. And again, I'm happy, pleased with the government of Kenya, their leadership holding this technical conference in Nairobi, bringing together over 48 African member states to sit, discuss, and see how they can concretize the Kampala Declaration, have that one expanded. And then during the African Climate Summit, of course, led by Kenya in coordination with the African Union, then throughout even the African Climate Week, hopefully there will be concrete decisions and discussion that will carry through in COP 28 to highlight more on human mobility and climate change.
Very important. And of course, next week we will have the Africa Climate Summit taking place here in Nairobi. And it shall be starting from the 4th of September. And of course, details are running on your screens. The Africa Climate Summit. Very important conversation. Now let's go back to these issues concerning human mobility, especially here in the country. Now, from where you sit, IOM has played key roles. I am aware that you recently had an event, all right, that was held to, sensitize people, and of course, these were also interventions that were there. Tell me about this recent event that you had.
I think you're referring to the technical conference on climate change that we held and mobility. It's not IOM that held that event. Just let me clarify and correct you on that. We only provided technical support and facilitated that conference. It was led by the government of Kenya and Uganda. Bringing together the African member states. I said 48 of them gathered in Kenya to discuss on issues of human mobility and climate change and see how they can plan for the expansion of the Kampala Ministerial Declaration on Migration, Environment and Climate Change. And I'm very happy to announce that an addendum has been finalized. As I speak, yesterday was the deadline. So I look forward to having that addendum adopted or signed during the summit next week. Coming back...
And still... did you have a meeting last week on youth engagement?
Yes, last week we also had, of course, youth, very, very critical. When I gave the story of Jackie, and she was, among the youth, and her brother was also affected in this. So if you have any important discussion and you don't bring in the voice, the opinion, the experience of Jackie, then you're doing her a disservice. And we have seen climate change affecting mainly the youth who lose out on opportunities, who lose out on livelihood. And what we do as IOM, we make sure that they're actually part of this conversation. And that's why last week on 16th to 18th of this month, we brought in over 70 young men and women from over 37 African countries to sit and discuss on climate-related issues and how they can prepare for the youth conference statement that will be in readiness for the African Climate Summit next week and the African Climate Week. So the youth discussed, came up with some position, some recommendations, and these recommendations actually were presented in the plenary discussions during the expansion of the Kampala Declaration. And these have all been incorporated, being reflected even in that addendum. I believe that now their position as youth have been very much incorporated.
All right. Now, yes, something to add, even as you're adding that, I would like you to just give us a word, a parting shot, your call to action to all Kenyans watching us today. We are talking about human mobility and how climate change affects us as we bring this conversation to a close.
Yeah, thank you very much once again, Rom. Maybe just quickly, briefly, if I could highlight on what we do as IOM. IOM is our strategy in terms of addressing climate change and human mobility. We have mainly 3 pillars. One, looking at people on the move to make sure that we actually support them, people who are actually to help them move and to help them stay. Because people,
I love that. I love that. People who are on the move, you help them move, and then you help them
to stay. And how are they staying? And help them to move. As I said, migration is part of us. We can never run out from it. But how is it being done? In a safe, orderly, and responsible way. And we do that in coordination with our donors, with our UN agencies, of course, with government. Without Kenya's government supporting this work, I don't think it would be possible. Now, and we have done quite a lot in that with support of the Japan government. I thank the people of Japan for their support. The Central Emergency Response Fund to provide this sort of support. The US government to look at climate change, human mobility, and human trafficking. Maybe I need to come back here and talk about human trafficking.
We need to have a conversation on
exactly.
that. Yeah.
And my very parting shot is that let us make sure that we incorporate human mobility in all the discussions to do with climate change. We need to take action now. If we don't take action, we will see more of the jackies getting affected. Climate change and human mobility are very much connected. You can never separate them, but we need to do something at a very urgently and a significant scale.
Wow. Wow. We need to have that conversation. You've given us a very fantastic idea. Climate change and, of course, human mobility and human trafficking.
Yes.
How does it play a role? And of course, it is on that note that we bring this conversation to a close. I wish you the best. Keep doing what you're doing.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ram, for having me.
Thank you so much for coming. And of course, I'm looking forward to seeing the engagements that will be there next week at the Africa Climate Summit.
Sure. Thank you. We have a side event that is being hosted by our Director General-elect, Amy Pope. She's leading all this, so you're welcome, and very, very high-profile dignitaries. The UNFCCC head management will be there, and of course, leadership also from the US government. So you're all welcome to attend this side event on migration and climate change and call to action. People should commit that, and I'm calling upon all development partners to actually provide support, immediate support to the communities that are affected.
Very important.
Maybe I forgot to mention that according to the UNFCCC assessment report, over 3 million people are actually at the risk of getting displaced. So those communities need our immediate support.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much for coming. And it is on that note that we'll bring this conversation to a close. And of course, it has been a pleasure having you, Dimanche, Sharon, the Chief of Mission at IOM Kenya. My name is Ram Aguko, but still, we continue with this conversation. Let's take a break, and then we will be back in a bit. Keep it KBC Channel 1, the Africa Climate Summit. My, oh my, I'm looking forward to seeing that event. God bless you.